Hello and welcome to ILTV's Israel Daily. I'm Aaron Porras, and coming up in today's newscast, the Israeli government outlines a host of new coronavirus regulations. Meanwhile, nearly 800 million shekels are poured into a new student security net. And oh, how I have missed Free Slushy Day in July. 7-Eleven convenience stores may be finally coming to Israel. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu laying bombshell announcements on the press Monday night, unveiling a whole set of new or modified coronavirus lockdown regulations. Here we are again, coronavirus infections rising in Israel as national lockdown exit procedures grind to a halt. But with millions unemployed or otherwise in financial distress, a compromise has been set in motion. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu unveiling the latest rules Monday night. First, the tightening of lockdowns in red cities. Second, the enacting of a nighttime curfew in orange cities. Third, the streamlining of the process of designating an orange city as red. Fourth, increasing enforcement and higher fines for breaking regulations. Fifth, the opening of shopping centers as of tomorrow in green cities. Sixth, the pilot opening of malls and markets. And seventh, the opening of classrooms in grades 5 and 6, followed by grades 11 and 12 a week later. Additionally, both Eilat and the Dead Sea areas have been approved to reopen for local Israeli tourism under the Green Islands Plan.
התרבות במובן של מתווה מסודר לכך וכך צופים בשטח פתוח איפה שאפשר, אלה דברים שאנחנו כבר למשל עובדים עליהם בנושא של אילת. כאן אנחנו בהמשך נאפשר גם כנראה מתווה זה או אחר לתרבות, וגם ברחבי הארץ, מה שיהיה ניתן לעשות, אנחנו נעשה.
But as Netanyahu reiterates, any progress can quickly be undone.
אנחנו בנקודה קריטית כי אנחנו בודקים את מה שקרוי מקדם ההדבקה, ולצערי הוא עולה. לכן אנחנו חייבים, פשוט מוכרחים, להוריד אותו בחזרה. ולכן אסור שנפעל בחיפזון, רק לאט ובטוח. אם נהיה פזיזים, אנחנו עלולים לראות זינוק מהיר מאוד בתחלואה, שיפגע גם בבריאות וגם בכלכלה.
In fact, the current infection rate is now at 1.8. Overnight infections rising by over 860 to 8,137 active cases, and the death toll rising to 2,736. Restrictions aren't the only weapon, though, as well. Netanyahu going on to outline Israel's advanced plans to acquire vaccinations.
אני בטוח ששמעתם את החדשות המצוינות מהיום של חברת מודרנה, על כך שהיא פיתחה חיסון לקורונה ביעילות של 94.5%. כבר בחודש יוני השארתי יחד עם שר הבריאות, יולי אדלשטיין, את החתימה עם חברת מודרנה על הספקה של חיסונים לישראל, ואני רוצה להבטיח לכם שישראל תהיה אחת המדינות הראשונות שתקבל את החיסון של מודרנה. אתם זוכרים גם שביום שישי האחרון חתמנו גם עם חברת פייזר על הספקה של 8 מיליון חיסונים ל4 מיליון אזרחים, זה 2 מנות חיסון לכל אזרח.
Of course, this is to say nothing for the potential long-term effects of these vaccines, however, 2 of which, Moderna's and Pfizer's, work on RNA, which is a wholly new process with no studies. So just to be sure, the premier is adding a third vaccine to the menu as well.
לפני שעה קלה שוחחתי עם נשיא רוסיה, ולדימיר פוטין, על האפשרות לרכוש אופציה על החיסון ספוטניק 5, ואנחנו נדון בזה בימים הקרובים. המטרה שלי היא להביא כמה שיותר חיסונים, מכמה שיותר מקומות, לכמה שיותר אזרחים, וכמה שיותר מהר.
Now, health aside, the coronavirus is, of course, also severely affecting people's pockets. And as with many crises, school-aged children and young adults are the most impacted. Luckily, there's now been a plan for that, too. Israeli authorities moving forwards with an unprecedented, almost 800 million shekel economic safety net, specifically aimed at helping students hurt by the pandemic. Pursuant to the directive from Prime Minister Netanyahu, Finance Minister Katz, Education Minister Elkin, and many others, the nearly $240 million in cash will be doled out for grant programs, including but not limited to expanding scholarships and additional financial assistance for tens of thousands of students on the basis of socioeconomic status or community and social activity. Second, for promoting and affording youth employment and internship opportunities. And third, a one-time drop in security fees at academic institutions of 50%. Joining me now with more on the government's new educational safety net, Jonathan Davis, head of the Rafael Recanati International School at IDC Herzliya. Thank you so much for being with me. All right,
Thank you, Aaron. Great to be on.
It's our pleasure. So how many students are currently getting financial aid or, have been qualifying for financial aid up until now?
Well, it depends on the university or college.
At IDC, I'm sorry.
At IDC itself, there are at least 1,000 students who are on scholarship right now, who have applied for socioeconomic based scholarships. So approximately 16% of our student body.
Wow. And how many of them have lost their aid or any grant money as a consequence of the recent lockdowns? For example, students with certain volunteering obligations with the elderly, et cetera, that could not be met. They couldn't meet those obligations. Many of them lost or had to fight to keep their grants.
You're 100% right. And we have to go into a different kind of area code here and look at the students in a different way. They're facing all kinds of challenges. They've been fired from many of the part-time jobs which they've had. And we have to be extremely sensitive. I take my hats off, by the way, to the students who are not only facing the challenge, the socioeconomic challenge, they're also facing the challenge of distance learning as a result of the situation right now in Israel. It's tantamount on the part of all of us to be extremely sensitized to the needs of students on a socioeconomic basis. And you mentioned that the government of Israel is going to be assisting. I think it's critical that the government of Israel assists the various students at universities and colleges based on their real need, and that it filters down to the right people. Because we had heard about unemployment and the government doling out funds to unemployed, and it wasn't always getting to the right places at the right time and in the most efficient manner. So I really hope they've done the lessons learned and that the needy students will get the assistance they actually need.
Well, so that being said, with that in mind, what was done up until now, at least from IDF's perspective, to help some of these students or former lone soldiers or Olim Chadashim, et cetera?
Well, actually, the lone soldiers are in great need. I find that at IDC, we have 300 former lone soldiers. Many of them have socioeconomic needs. I'm sure all of the rest of the universities and colleges in Israel also have these needs. The governmental assistance and assistance of other organizations for lone soldiers has not really been enough. We've found that we have to beef up as much as possible our assistance for lone soldiers. They have needs above and beyond a regular soldier who is released. They don't have their parents in the country. They need to be assisted. I can tell you that for me, it's a very personal thing, because I myself was once a lone soldier in the paratroopers, and it's one of my favorite things to try and do is assist lone soldiers.
Yeah, especially because, as you've already mentioned or hinted at, many of the lone soldiers, of course, don't have a support network or locally or a family to help them financially. So will this new plan address these major issues that we've been discussing, that you've been hit with?
In my personal view, Aaron, the proof is in the pudding. First of all, we need to see how the government manages to distribute these funds so that they go down into each specific university and college, and each student who is really needy gets those funds and gets those funds as soon as possible. And unfortunately, frequently when you have governmental bodies dealing with personalized situations, it doesn't always work. I'm trying to look at the half a cup that's full.
Of course.
And I'm really, really hoping that there's going to be some sort of a mechanism here that ensures all of those people, Aaron, that you know and I know who need that assistance, that they're going to be able to gain that assistance.
All right, Jonathan Davis, thank you so much for joining us, and I hope to have you back when we have a little bit more results to speak on. Thank you.
Thank you, Aaron.
All right, another news, a tragic accident to the south in Ashdod. An explosion at a local metal recycling plant, leaving 2 dead and at least 2 more injured Tuesday morning. Magen David Adom paramedics saying that they were greeted with destruction upon arrival to the scene, where they pronounced the 2 deaths and urgently evacuated survivors with injuries to their limbs. Now, according to initial investigations, the blast appears to have been a workplace accident with 2 gas canisters going up in flames. But the cause of the canister's initial ignition is still unknown. What is suspected, though, according to sources close to the incident, is that the business may have been operating without a license. Speaking of explosions, Israeli Ambassador to the United States Ron Dermer now joining the chorus of other Middle Eastern diplomats making explosive comments regarding President-elect Joe Biden's likely approach to Iran. Nittany Manson reports.
There's much speculation regarding President-elect Joe Biden's position on Iran and, by extension, the JCPOA nuclear deal. Biden has often indicated that he would look to re-enter the deal after President Trump withdrew the United States from it in 2018 and instead reinstated economic sanctions. Israel and her new allies in the Arab Gulf, then, are hoping to moderate Biden's stance. Israeli ambassador to the U.S. Ron Dermer and his counterparts in the UAE and Bahrain now issuing a joint statement arguing that the return to the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action would be a mistake, while urging Biden to re-examine the reality in the Middle East before making any decisions. Beyond warnings, though, other real actionable measures that Dermer says will put the U.S. in a better negotiating position are outlined, including continuing to broker ties between Israel and Arab neighbors. The statement urging Biden to sit with allies in the region and talk to us in order to get a common position on Iran, not only in the nuclear issue, but also on Iran's aggression in the region. Prime Minister Netanyahu, for his part, just speaking of his future with the new administration and saying he plans to speak with the president-elect soon. Nittany Manson, ILTV.
So will Biden go through with attempts to re-enter the JCPOA nuclear deal with Iran? And if so, what might that even look like? Joining us to discuss is columnist for Newsweek and the editor of HistoryCentral.com, Mark Schulman, and the counsel for Republicans Overseas Israel, Abe Katzman. Gentlemen, thank you so much. Now, Israel, the United Arab Emirates, and Bahrain have issued a joint statement asking President-elect Joe Biden to talk to them before doing anything really in the region, specifically re-entering the JCPOA, which the ambassador to the United States from Israel said would be a mistake. Do you think that Biden should listen? Abe?
I think that that's probably pretty good advice. It's always good to be joined with your allies and a united front, especially those who are going to be most affected by this deal and who are, quite honestly, terrified of Iran actually going nuclear. So I'd have to say so. Besides, I think there are a lot of bad reasons being thrown around for going back into this deal to begin with. But even just on its own, yes, consult with the allies.
Do you think that he will, Mark?
I think he will. There's no question. The one thing that Biden is consensus builder. So there's no reason why he won't do it. I mean, keep in mind, this is pretty low on his priorities. The priority number 1, number 2, and number 3 is going to be COVID, COVID, COVID. And I think worrying about Iran is going to be down there on his list, and certainly worrying about Israel in that sense is not going to be the number 1 thing he's going to do. But I have no doubt in my mind that he'll definitely consult. Remember, it was the Israeli government that refused to consult once a preliminary agreement was reached with Iran, refused to get involved in consulting about the details of that agreement. So I have no doubt that Biden will try to build a consensus before he does anything. And like I said before, I think he'll only rejoin an agreement if certain conditions are met. It's imperative that the Israeli government works with him and tries to help direct him towards, if he's going to rejoining with certain conditions and not fight him. I mean, that's the key. The Israeli government has made too many mistakes in the last few years of fighting any democratic administration. The best thing to do is to go with it. You know, when you get stuck in a wave, you go with the wave. You don't fight the wave. And in this case, Israel has to learn how to go with the wave and help direct the wave in this case. And if the Israeli government fully engages the American government in this direction and fully engages the Biden administration, I think it can influence what direction it takes. We don't know whether Iran will agree to whatever terms that the Biden administration puts, but the reality is that's what has to happen because, first of all, the nuclear program has to stop. Remember, that when Trump took office, they had 105 kilograms of nuclear fuel. They now have 2.5 tons. So something has to change, and has to change quickly.
All right, but speaking specifically then of the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, Iran says that they hope Biden will unconditionally return to the deal. Is that even possible, Abe?
I suppose it's probably technically possible. Look, the deal has sunset clauses. It would all expire in 2025, right around the end of President Trump's second term. Okay. But anyway, that's very soon. And while Biden has all kinds of ideas about what it is that he would like in the deal, the Iranians aren't stupid, and they're not going to go chasing after this. It's not a really good sign that we have the name Wendy Sherman is being thrown around. I mean, she was one of the negotiators of it the first time around. But keep in mind, in terms of the point that Mark made just before, remember, this was, even under Obama, this was a deal that he could not get a majority of the Senate to get behind, including people from his own party. So, there were a couple of moves made legislatively, but ultimately this wasn't something like a treaty that was ratified by the Senate. So if they're going to come up with something serious, I don't think that Iran is going to agree to anything that the Senate would agree to.
Mark?
Well, the Senate doesn't have to agree. I mean, there are very few treaties that actually, treaties have to be ratified by the Senate, but very few international agreements have gone to the Senate for agreement in the last couple of decades because of all the rifts in the United States on these issues. But the reality is, look, we don't know what Iran will agree to. Obviously, their starting point is no changes, but that's very nice. That's their starting point. They're good negotiators. And I'm sure the Biden starting point will be, 10 different changes or whatever it might be. But I believe that the bottom line, the key thing that cannot be allowed to happen is to rejoin the agreement with the current sunset clause in place. And I'm quite sure that the Biden administration understands that as well. Like I just mentioned, the sunset clause expires in 5 years, or a little over 4 years from now. That's quite different than 10 years in the future. 10 years, you can say, 10 years, who knows what it'll be. But now 4 years in the future, we know that little will change. So the reality is the only way that the Biden administration is going to agree to rejoin it is going to be by changing the sunset clause. And that's the biggest problem that always existed in the agreement, was the fact the sunset clause was there. So I see the Biden administration pushing for that. We have to push them towards that direction. We can't fight them. We have to go with them and push them in the direction we want them to go in. And I think that's the most important thing.
All right. Well, I want to talk now for a moment about Trump's refusal to concede the election. How might that actually affect or even maybe embolden Iran and the Ayatollah regime in the Middle East? This harkens back to the example of 9/11, actually, which many experts in the United States have said was made possible because of a delayed changeover between the Clinton and the Bush administrations.
Look, this is a disaster for the United States, a disaster for the world. This is undermining American democracy. And most importantly, like you said, the transition, especially in the national security field, need to take place in a smooth way. Now, look, if he concedes tomorrow morning or allows transition to start tomorrow morning, okay, a two-week delay won't be a disaster. But if this keeps on going and it keeps on pushing this and we go into December and there still hasn't been a transition, then we're really endangering the future of the United States. We're endangering any sort of agreement and weakening the United States, not to mention what it's doing to American democracy.
Well,
there's no question.
And what about in the Middle East? Because, again, we're here in Israel and we're going to bear any sort of effects that might have. Abe, how do you respond?
Clearly it weakens us. Go ahead.
I'm sorry. I don't think that, to begin with, that this undermines democracy. I think that's kind of silly, in fact, if the delay is being caused by lawsuits, assuming that they are meritorious to at least some degree. Rule of law matters in a democracy as much as anything else. It's not just a matter of people casting votes. There's
It's just a fake. Come on, enough. The Republicans abroad
Well,
need to take the
Gentlemen, I don't want to talk about the merits of the lawsuits. I don't want to talk about the merits of the lawsuits. I want to talk about how it affects America's persona and image in the world stage with respect to Iran's aggression in the region, especially considering the fact that, the Ayatollah regime, Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah, the proxy of Iran, are essentially laughing at President Trump, saying, that he's a bully and that the whole world is against him, as they always knew.
Well, what they say along those lines, I don't think bothers anybody very much. They can say it. They've had a tough few years, certainly dealing with a very hardline administration. And I think there's a great deal of relief in Hezbollah, and the Palestinian Authority, and Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and in Iran. And as far as I know, the general feeling in the Israeli intel world is that Iran was working very hard to try to defeat President Trump. I don't think they can make all the fun they want. I think, if anything, the people in Iran wish they could be living in as democratic a state as the United States of America.
All right, Mark Shulman, final comment.
I don't disagree with the last comment for sure. Look, it weakens the United States to some extent. Come March, everyone will forget it in terms of, except the Trump supporters that'll still believe the election was stolen. So in terms of American security, it's not going to make any difference. It weakens the United States generally, but again, come March, we'll forget that it ever happened. Maybe we'll do a change after Hoover FDR. Hoover was inaugurated in March, and people decided that was too long. So maybe we'll change it now and make the inauguration next time in December or something closer, so there isn't this 8-9 week period of time of unknown that we've suddenly created. So
all right,
we'll see what happens.
We certainly will. Thank you again, Abe Katzman, Mark Shulman, for joining us.
Thank you.
Our pleasure.
Moving on, ask and you shall receive. CNN anchor Christiane Amanpour apologizing Monday evening for comments made last week in which she compared President Trump's actions to that of the Nazi regime and pogroms. The apology coming in the wake of harsh criticism from Israeli and Jewish authorities worldwide, calling the false equivalence to be a belittling and minimizing distortion of the immense tragedy of the Holocaust that only encourages anti-Semitic voices. Well, Amanpour is now admitting that she should not have juxtaposed the two thoughts, Hitler and his evil standing alone, of course, in history, and adding that she regrets any pain her statements may have caused. That said, Amanpour went on to qualify her statement, saying that she was just trying to show how democratic values can slip away and must always be zealously guarded. Now, if you're anything like me, moving to Israel has had its ups and downs, but finally, one of the drawbacks is being addressed appropriately. 7-Eleven convenience stores are set to make their way into the Holy Land, and I'll finally be able to get my slushie on. Chana Rifkin with the story.
Longtime staple for midnight snacking in the US and 20 other countries, now closer than ever to making its Israel debut. The 7-Eleven convenience store franchise now in late stages of negotiation with Israeli companies Fox and Electra to open roughly 250 branches across the Holy Land, much to the excitement of expats everywhere. Electra saying in a report that the plan is to first sign a non-binding memorandum of understanding, after which the details of the franchise agreement will be worked out. But as exciting as this is, American expats waiting for some of their favorite snacks to arrive with the 7-Eleven brand may be in for a bit of a surprise. The chain stocks slightly different products depending on the country hosting it, and Israel, for one, will likely require an entirely kosher selection.
And now let's take a look at the weather forecast. Tonight, another cloudy evening with cool lows of about 57 degrees Fahrenheit or 14 degrees Celsius. Then tomorrow, you can expect more partly cloudy skies and an average high of 77 degrees Fahrenheit or 14 degrees Celsius. Now, before we go, of course, let's take a look at what's going viral in Israel. All right. That didn't look like a human driving. And it's not. Of course! Knowing ILTV producers, there's no way that would be a human driving. Oh boy. He seems pretty good though. He's a talented pup. All right, that is it for today's news. Today's exchange rate is 3.37 shekels to the American dollar and 2.58 shekels to the Canadian dollar. For more news from ILTV, please like ILTV on Facebook, follow us on Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube and Roku TV pages. I'm Aaron Porras. Thank you so much for watching.